Wonderful. Thanks so much, Rachel. I really appreciate it. And thanks so much to all of you for joining. We had originally hoped to do this in person in the spring, I think, and life happened. So it's nice to see all of you on Zoom instead. So as Rachel mentioned, I'm going to talk about my book today. This is a book that came out earlier this year. It's called Short Circuiting Policy, and it's the accumulation of 7 years of work of studying the electric power industry in this country and trying to understand, is it transitioning to clean energy? Is it moving fast enough? Those kinds of questions. And so when I was near the end of writing this book, what I tried to do was benchmark what we need to be doing to tackling the climate crisis versus what we are doing. And what I came up with is basically this little figure that shows you where we are in terms of clean electricity and where we need to go. And somebody on the internet called it the narwhal curve because there's this black line going through the middle of it. It looks a little bit like a narwhal spear. So if you were to set 2050 as the timeline through which we are targeting 100% clean energy, then it looks like we're on track, right? That's what this figure shows us. But if you look more carefully, you'll see that actually we've been living on borrowed time in many ways, with our nuclear fleet being a steady chunk of our clean energy. Actually, nuclear provides more than half of our clean electricity in this country. And hydro, of course, being a pretty stable chunk, varies over year based on rainfall and things like that, but we're not building a lot of new hydro. There isn't actually a lot of new hydro to build in this country. And instead, the thing that is growing is, of course, renewable energy. But what you should notice is that while that is growing quickly, it is certainly not growing fast enough. And we know that that nuclear slice could be dropping off pretty rapidly as plants retire across the country. And so not only does renewable energy have to keep pace with the retiring nuclear, it also has to ratchet itself up to go right up that black line. And of course, that's targeting 2050. Well, what if we're talking more like 2030 or 2035, as many people have been talking about right now? I'm sure you're aware that the Biden campaign has made a pledge to have 100% clean electricity by 2035 and try to get a bill passed through Congress that would target that goal. Well, if that's the goal, we're very behind schedule. That just shows you what the benchmark would look like for 2030 if you put 2000 as the starting line, and you can see how far we are behind where we need to be. And so I think a lot of people have a sort of folk theory that the US electricity system is cleaning up, and that is true in many ways if you just look at emissions. But if you look at the scale of the challenge, you understand that no, we're not moving fast enough. And of course, that doesn't even take into consideration the need to electrify other sectors of our economy, right? A big way that we're going to solve climate change is by cleaning up our electricity system and using that clean electricity for buildings rather than cooking with fossil gas, for driving cars rather than using oil, and even for maybe about half of our heavy industry, the parts that can be decarbonized through electrification. And were we to do all those things, we'd actually be something like 70 to 80% of the way to solving this problem. So this is a really, really important thing. But keep in mind that if we're going to use electricity to clean up transportation, buildings, industry, etc., we need more electricity, right? Because the electricity that we have today, we're of course already using for all the things that we use it for. And if we're also going to use electricity for our cars and our homes and industry, we're going to need more. How much more? It could be something as a doubling of the amount of electricity that we have right now. It could even be a tripling, depending on if we make a lot of hydrogen, for example. So we're talking about a massive growth in the scale of the electricity system. And so when we have 100% as our target, in some ways, we're not thinking about 100% of what? What is the unit that we're talking about? It's actually more like 200% of the current electricity system that needs to be clean within the coming decades. So this is a massive, massive challenge. Now, the response that we have had to this huge challenge is largely state leadership. Over the past several decades, states have stepped up and have taken pledges to clean up their electricity system. And that's really what I study in my book, these efforts to make targets and timetables for a cleaner electricity system. You probably don't know that California set one of the first targets ever in 1978, more than 40 years ago now. And its target was to have 1% wind energy within a decade. So that's where we started off, right? It wasn't 100% or 10% or anything like that. It was 1% clean wind energy. And they met that target. And 40 years later, from 1978 to 2018, California set a target for 100% clean electricity by 2045. So that's kind of been the evolution of these targets. Now, of course, we can't wait 40 years for every other state to be moving from 1% as a goal to 100%. And we still have a lot of states that don't have any renewable energy goal. So this figure shows you the places that have acted. What you'll notice is that after around 2010, very few states acted. All the ones in italics, by the way, are just voluntary, which I love to say is not even worth the paper it's written on. These voluntary targets, which are either done at the state level or increasingly utilities, are making these voluntary pledges that mean basically nothing. And so, you know, we have to go back to the beginning of the Obama administration to find a wave of binding clean energy goals. And those include Ohio and Kansas, which are two states that I study in my book that actually repealed their clean energy target. So we have lost, you know, well over a decade now of progress. At the same time that these clean energy targets were being passed at the state level, there was also net metering laws being passed. That's shown at the bottom of the screen. And net metering laws, you're probably familiar with them. They basically set the rules that if you're going to put solar on your roof and generate some electricity, how much money are you going to be paid for providing that electricity to the grid? And the original idea was that you should be paid the net price. So if you're buying a unit of electricity, a kilowatt hour, for 15 cents, you should be able to sell it for 15 cents as well. So that was the original idea, and many, many states did it, but suddenly it became very controversial. Because what's been happening, as I have been previewing and is also the subject of my book, is that these clean energy targets and these net metering policies, these small piecemeal efforts that we have to clean up our electricity system, they are being attacked by electric utilities and fossil fuel companies. And these companies are trying to slow down the clean energy transition. My book is an effort to describe all the ways that these companies try to undermine what we would call policy feedback. Let me explain what policy feedback is. When advocates first decided, hey, let's pass a clean energy target, like in California in 1978, they didn't really want to stop with a 1% wind energy goal, right? Their idea was, if we can get 1% wind energy, suddenly we're going to have industry in California. And that's exactly what happened. In the 1980s, California was the global leader for renewables. They were putting in these solar projects, some of which still operate today, like the SEGS projects, and also these wind turbines. If you've ever been to Palm Springs, you'll see these old projects that I'm talking about. And what that did was it catalyzed a new industry in California. And the idea was that policy itself can reshape politics by creating new interest groups who come and advocate for that policy to be increased over time. So the feedback is between a policy starting in time one, increasing the amount of advocates that we have, like clean energy companies, because those companies now have resources as a function of the policy. And those companies then go and lobby to increase the policy. And so the idea was that we would get this virtuous cycle, right? We'd have a 1% target, then we'd have a 20% target, then we'd have a 50% target. And actually there was a 33 in between there when it comes to California. And then we'd have a 100% target. And that is how things have played out in California. But in most other states, things have not played out that way. We have a number of different problems. We have the Southeast, which has never acted to create a clean energy target in the first place. So the whole part of the Southeast pretty much doesn't have these targets. Then we have states that passed targets, but then met them and then never ramped them up over time. So they're never going from, let's say, 20% as a goal to 30% to 50 to 100. They're just staying put. And then we have a third group, which are states that pass these targets, but rather than meet them, electric utilities and fossil fuel companies attacked them and they rolled them back over time. So how did they do that? How did these opponents manage to weaken policies that were supposed to lock themselves in over time? Use a variety of tactics, and they're listed here. They include things like lobbying. And lobbying can be very effective from these companies because they invest an enormous amount of resources in both campaign contributions and also relationships. What they do is they become very close with legislators over time, whether that's through providing them funds for their reelection, meeting with them, providing them information on bills, these kinds of things. And there ends up being a very symbiotic relationship between our legislators and to some extent our regulators and these companies. They also use primaries and elections to try to influence the kinds of positions that these politicians take, and I'm going to talk about that in detail. And they use what's called astroturfing. So, the public is a way that politicians often think about what they should be doing on policy, right? That's the basic idea of democracy. Well, what if you were a corporation that wanted to stop the clean energy transition? What if you were able to change what it looks like the public thinks about clean energy? And so that's exactly what electric utilities and fossil fuel companies have been doing. They've been running fake grassroots campaigns, which called astroturfing, like fake grass, and have been saying that people don't care about climate change. They don't care about clean energy. And they've been doing that to try to convince politicians to get rid of these laws. And of course, there's just good old-fashioned court cases to try to sue and slow down the implementation of clean energy laws. The Clean Air Act, implemented through the Clean Power Plan federally, would be a theory of how policy is made in practice. And it's telling me my internet connection is unstable, so hopefully this will be okay. So, often we think that politicians and their staff know a lot about a given policy area and that they know what they're doing when they pass a law, and that interest groups too, they have their interests and they know what they want to happen. Well, I don't think that's true. And what I argue is that there's actually a lot of ambiguity and uncertainty in our legislative process. And so I call that the fog of enactment, which is an idea that under certain circumstances, things like new bills, right? When an RPS was a new idea, or when we have federal and state jurisdiction overlapping. And so how these policies are going to interact is a bit hard to know. If we're passing a really large major reform, so what we might call an omnibus bill, where we're sticking tons and tons of stuff and the document is stretching hundreds and hundreds of pages long. All of these or also one more thing, when technology is changing really quickly, right? Solar panel costs are just falling dramatically over time. All of these things make it really hard for politicians and their staff and even interest groups to forecast what was happening. And so in the early 2000s, that ambiguity really served clean energy advocates because they caught a lot of utilities off guard and they were able to pass these clean energy policies. However, once these laws are implemented, there is learning that goes on. And I don't mean learning in some apolitical way where we're just learning the right thing to do or we're going to do a better job next time. I mean political learning, which is when utilities learn that net metering is fundamentally not in their profit interests, that renewable portfolio standards are pushing off their coal assets faster, and that they have sunk an enormous amount of debt into those projects, and that's not in their financial interest. So they're learning more about how this law is affecting their interests once the law is implemented. And once that learning happens, these opponents, electric utilities and fossil fuel companies, don't just lay down and play dead. We don't win in the first round, right? What they do is that they mobilize through their networks to attack the policy and try to weaken it, okay? So the kinds of networks that I'm talking about here are the American Legislative Exchange Council, or ALEC, which is an organization that operates across the states, and it marries together right-wing legislators with corporate interests, including electric utilities. And that is exactly the group that created this model bill called the Electricity Freedom Act, which was aiming to repeal clean energy targets across the states. But it's also groups like the Edison Electric Institute, which is the trade association of monopoly private utilities. And, that organization put out this report in 2013 called Disruptive Challenges, which very clearly outlined that net metering was a threat to the utility business model and that they would do everything that they could to attack and repeal that law. And that's been very successful because over the past couple of years, almost every single state with a net metering law has had a proceeding to try to weaken that over time. So these are the kinds of right-wing corporate networks that operate across the states, that share information, and that allow these interest groups to have a lot of power. And what I argue is that the advocates, clean energy companies, environmental groups, consumers, they don't have those same networks operating across states. They don't have that same connective tissue that allows them to get their interests put into law in the same way as these fossil fuel companies and electric utilities do. Okay, so you probably know that legislators write bills and that bills eventually become a law, right? This is this famous cartoon. And so the question is, where does the story go from there? Feedback theory really starts, and it's also where my book kicks off. So the feedback theory is that laws themselves, once they're implemented, redistribute resources between advocates and opponents. Suddenly, it's not as profitable to be operating that coal plant. And suddenly, there are groups being paid money to create clean energy, right? So we've got these clean energy companies growing, and we have these utilities losing money. Now, these interest groups respond to that policy change, and they can directly lobby legislators and their staff to make changes, and they can also indirectly try to change it. In political science, there was this very important political scientist in mid-century named Schachtschneider who came up with this theory of expanding the scope of conflict. The basic point is that you make the fight bigger. If you're not getting what you want, why not bring the public into your fight? And that's exactly what utilities have been doing by running these astroturfing campaigns. So if you're not getting what you want and you want to make the fight bigger as a corporate interest group, you can do it in two ways. You can do it in an honest way, which is what we call outside lobbying, or you can do it in a dishonest way, which is what we call astroturfing. So let me explain what outside lobbying is first and give you an example. Outside lobbying is the idea that, let's say you're a utility and you don't like this renewable energy law. What you can do is you could organize a bunch of people who are your customers, let's say, and tell your customers, hey, we don't like this law. It's going to jack up your bills. That may or may not be true, but you could say that. And then you could say to your customers, you should reach out to the commissioners at the Public Utility Commission to let them know. Or you could say, write to your legislators to let them know, right? So that's a way that an organized interest group is trying to organize the public and get the public to lobby on their behalf. But ultimately, those are real people who aren't being paid to do it. They might share those concerns and, they're acting as public members in an honest way. So that's what outside lobbying is. Now, astroturfing is the dishonest version of that. This image on this slide gives you an example of what it looks like. It's from Kansas, which is one of the cases in my book. And Kansas, as you may know, is where Koch Industries, the corporation, the petrochemical corporation, is headquartered. And they have a very large political organization called Americans for Prosperity. It's sometimes even thought of as like a third political party in this country in terms of the amount of resources and architecture that they have built through Americans for Prosperity. And what they did is that they really did not like the clean energy law in Kansas. And so they used their lobbyists through Americans for Prosperity to lobby against the law. We know this because some Republicans wrote that publicly. And suddenly this group popped up called the Kansas Seniors Alliance. And these flyers started to go around saying, Kansas seniors are already financially stressed. Higher utility bills aren't helping. And it told a story of how this clean energy goal was jacking up the utility bills. And it told people, look at all these old senior people who are upset. Let's call our politicians. So there was a journalist and he wanted to know, who's running this Kansas Seniors Alliance? So he looked up the organization that had been incorporated. I think it was a 501c3. And he said, hey, who incorporated this organization? There was no website. There was no people associated with it publicly, and he found there was a lawyer whose name was on this document. And so he went to the lawyer and he said, hey, you know, who are you working for? Like, do you work for the Kansas Seniors Alliance? And the lawyer said, no, I don't work for them. I've never heard of them. I work for Americans for Prosperity, the Koch group. So basically this group created a front organization that made it seem like a bunch of Kansas seniors were all upset about electricity bills, when that was not accurate at all. There's an even worse story, which some of you may have heard me tell if you've been listening to things that I've been doing. I told this on the Chris Hayes podcast recently, but I'll tell it again because it's a good story. Good meaning terrible and awful. In New Orleans, the utility company Entergy wanted to build a gas plant. And in this case, they had to go to the city council to get permission to do it. And at the hearing for this gas plant, there was all these people there, and they said, we don't like solar, we like gas. And people were very confused. Like, these people didn't, like, where do these people come from? Who in the public goes to public hearing meetings to say yay gas and nay solar? I mean, if you just do public polls for context, you ask people like, what kinds of energy sources do you like? You get like 90% support for solar and like, you know, maybe 40% support for gas. So like, this is very strange to find a person like this, right? So it turned out that a journalist found out, they went up to these people and they said, hey, why do you like gas and hate solar? And the person said, oh, you know, I'm just reading lines. I'm an actor. I'm an out-of-work actor. And I was hired to come to this public hearing, and these are the lines that I'm supposed to be reading. And it turned out that Entergy had spent $27,000 through a third-party organization that had hired a bunch of actors to show up to a public meeting and to pretend that they liked fossil gas and did not like solar. So that's a very egregious case of astroturfing, but it just shows you that these are the kinds of things that are happening all across this country right now. And it's part of a really dark turn in terms of the strategies that utilities and fossil fuel companies are using to keep the status quo and to keep their profits, and unfortunately to endanger the climate stability for all of us. So not only are they acting in an anti-democratic way, as monopoly companies, might I add, with captured customers, they're also, of course, continuing to emit a large amount of greenhouse gases and imperiling the stability of this climate and leading to giant fires all across California and Colorado right now, for example. Okay, so that's the first thing that these companies are doing to indirectly shape policy. But I want to tell you another thing that they're doing, which can help you understand the polarization that we have seen over climate change and clean energy. If you've been working on these topics for a long time, like I have, you probably remember when Nancy Pelosi and Newt Gingrich sat on a couch together in front of the Capitol and made this ad, this political ad, where they said, we don't agree about many things, but there's one thing we agree about, and that's climate change. Can you imagine Mitch McConnell and Nancy Pelosi doing that today? No, you can't. So why is that? Why has the Republican Party moved so far away from the Democrats on this? And by the way, when we talk about polarization, what political science shows us empirically is that polarization is not a question of the two parties pulling farther and farther apart. Empirically, it's actually a question of the Republican Party becoming an extremist organization. That's just shown in the evidence. So when people say our politics are so divided or we have polarization, what the truth of the matter is that the Democrats have pretty much stayed in the same place. Nancy Pelosi is still Nancy Pelosi, and the Republicans have pulled very far away. And one of the most polarized issues that we have today is climate change. So why is that? Why did the Republicans move so far away from climate action? Well, I'm going to argue that it has a lot to do with primaries. So if you are a Republican that wants climate action, there are many of them, particularly at the state level. There's somebody in Kansas named Russ Jennings, who I write about in my book, who was very supportive of wind energy. He was a Republican from the western part of the state, and he had seen how the investment in clean energy from that clean energy law had brought wind turbines to his neighborhood, to his community, and had reinvigorated this rural part of the state that really had been underinvested in. And so when it came time for Koch Industries to put repealing the clean energy law on the agenda in Kansas, this Republican was not for it. He did not vote for the repeal. And in fact, the first time that it was brought up, let's get rid of this clean energy target, there were as many Republicans, 44, who voted for keeping the clean energy target as those who voted against it, 44 to 44. But the funny thing is that during this time period, they kept voting on the exact same bill about every 2 weeks. And so what we have here is a panel. We have a longitudinal study where we can see, well, at time 1, there were 44 Republicans who were willing to repeal the law. At time 2, suddenly there were 50. At time 3, there were 57. At time 4, there were 60. Why were these Republicans changing their minds? Well, as I mentioned, there was another Republican named Scott Schwab who wrote a letter, an email to his supporters, and he said that leaning on people to change their votes were Americans for Prosperity, Koch Industries, and that he had said to these lobbyists, why don't you do this publicly? Why are you doing it privately? And they wouldn't do it publicly. But in the background, what these groups were doing is that they were going from person to person in the Republican Party, and they were saying, you better change your vote. You better change your vote or else. What is the or else? Well, if you're a Republican running in Kansas, you need money for your election, right? Where do you get your money from? You get your money from the Kansas Republican Party. Who is the #1 donor to them, pretty much? Oh, it's Koch Industries. Okay. You also get your money from the Kansas Chamber of Commerce. Who is a top donor to the Kansas Chamber of Commerce? Oh, it's Koch Industries. Now you also get money from Koch Industries directly. So that is how you would finance your campaign. And what this company was doing is they were saying, if you don't change your vote on this issue, not only are we not going to fund you in your next election, you are going to find yourself with a very well-funded primary challenger. And that scares politicians, right? They don't like primary challengers. This is not a positive thing within any political party. And so it's quite a powerful threat. In the case of Russ Jennings, he did face a primary challenge and he won. But when he came back, along with many others, these politicians said, you know what, this isn't worth it anymore. Let's just lay down our arms and let them repeal the policy. And so they did repeal the policy. And so what you're doing is, whether or not you manage to kick out a given politician, you're sending a chilling signal across the entire Republican Party that if you are not anti-climate action, if you are not anti-clean energy, you're not allowed to be in this party, basically. And I'll tell you one more story, which is at the federal level, about Bob Inglis. Bob Inglis was a representative in Congress who did not start out as a climate believer, but when he was in Congress, he went on a couple scientific trips, I believe to the Antarctic and a couple other places, and he saw the melting of the ice and he saw climate change firsthand, and he listened to the scientists and he felt moved by it, and he realized climate change was real. And then he had a young son who came to him and he said, Dad, climate change is real. We know from the survey data that young Republicans are quite worried about climate change because they have to actually live on this planet that is currently on fire all across the Western United States. And they understand that there will be consequences for themselves if we don't start taking on this crisis. So he went to his dad, and his dad, Bob Inglis, had this sort of awakening moment where he realized that he needed to be pro-climate action. And so he became pro-climate action. And do you know what happened to Bob Inglis? Bob Inglis had a very well-funded primary challenger, and he lost his seat. And you don't have Bob Inglis in Congress anymore. So when you ask yourself, why is the Republican Party so anti-climate action? What has happened? Keep in mind that this is a new phenomenon, and that has a lot to do with the behavior of fossil fuel companies and electric utilities, threatening Republicans with primary challengers if they're not on the right side on this. And you can see this very much in the data. Historically, renewables, before electric utilities woke up to the threat of these policies to their bottom line, really, because they were in the fog of enactment. They didn't really understand what the consequences would be. Most of these clean energy laws were signed under Republicans. Quite famously, of course, in 1999 in Texas, George W. Bush was the governor, and he signed this clean energy law 3 years before California even passed their first comprehensive clean energy target. So this is the kind of history that we're talking about. And renewable portfolio standards specifically were designed with a trading mechanism in mind, these renewable electricity or renewable energy certificates. And that was a Republican idea with more efficiency, et cetera. So these were not polarized topics in the not so recent past. Now, of course, look what happens. By the time we hit 2005, the only policies that pass are passing under Democratic governors. Now, what we know again from political science is that as elites polarize, as politicians get these incentives from corporate interest groups to change their behavior, to change their position on a given policy, become anti-climate action, anti-clean energy, they start to say those things as well. I have lots of interesting stories about, for example, the governor of Ohio, John Kasich, as well as the governor of Kansas, Sternbach. Why am I blanking? You know what I'm talking about, the guy who did the really terrible gutting of the state. Anyway, these two governors would say these statements about pro-renewables. Then something would happen and they would suddenly be anti-renewables. These Republicans literally in one case had been in Congress and had written these letters saying we've got to, extend this renewable energy tax credit for wind energy. These were very pro-renewables people. In fact, the Kansas governor put solar on his own roof independently. He had his own Jimmy Carter moment, so to speak. So what happened? Well, interest groups got to them and they changed their position on these things. And John Kasich is quite a sad story in this regard because he still goes around as if he's a climate champion. But what many people don't know is that John Kasich signed a budget bill into law that changed the setback rule for wind turbines and made it absolutely impossible to build a wind project in the state of Ohio. You can't build a wind project in the state of Ohio because of John Kasich. And he could have line item vetoed that provision. So he didn't have to sign it into law by any means. That's the kind of legacy that he's left, even though he, speaks in the Democratic National Convention, claims to be a climate champion, etc. So the cases that I study in my book, I've kind of mentioned a bunch of them. I go through Texas, which is a very well-known case. I tell the history. But then I tell a story that's not as well known from Texas, which is how fossil fuel companies and electric utilities undermined their solar energy law. I tell the story of Koch Industries in Kansas that I've been sort of mentioning a bunch today. I talk about Arizona Public Service and its absolutely corrupt behavior in Arizona for several years, spending $50 million to undermine clean energy goals in that state. And then lastly, I talk about Ohio. And of course, that Ohio story has been in the news a lot lately because it's about First Energy and AEP, which are both companies that funneled bribery money, $60 million, to the former Ohio Speaker of the House, Larry Householder, who is still somehow a politician, despite being arrested by the FBI. And I kind of tell the ways that those electric utilities have completely corrupted the state and managed to get a coal bailout in Ohio, and while gutting the clean energy targets and the energy efficiency laws. So I will leave a few minutes at the end here for questions from all of you. But before I do that, I wanted to just mention something that I think not a lot of people know. You probably know that Exxon knew, Shell knew, BP knew, etc., that these fossil fuel companies knew that climate change was real. Of course, in the case of Exxon, they had their own in-house researchers who were literally projecting the amount of warming, the level of concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere in 2020, and they got it bang on. And they were doing this projection back in the 80s, I believe. So there's been fantastic reporting by investigative journalists and advocate groups about what Exxon knew, and of course by Naomi Oreskes and Jeffrey Supran and their work. But what you might not know is that electric utilities were right alongside fossil fuel companies doing the same thing. They were delaying the clean energy transition in many ways. And I write about that in my book. There's a whole chapter on this topic. They promoted a much more wasteful energy system. In the early 20th century, a lot of our electricity for industrial purposes was generated on site through what we call cogeneration, which is basically you're going to use the steam heat, which is waste, right? When you burn something like coal or gas, it throws off heat, right? And that heat is a form of energy that's pretty hard to use to do work. But if you're at an industrial facility where you need heat anyway to do something, you can use that heat and you can use the electricity that you're generating from the combustion. That's a much more efficient way to use electricity, right? Because when you're burning coal or fossil gas, you're losing like more than half of the energy just through the combustion process and through this waste heat. So when you do it on site, it's actually much more efficient. And what did electric utilities do? In the mid-20th century, they gave these sort of predatory contracts to industrial customers and said, you don't want to make your own electricity, we can make it for you and we'll make it cheaper. And so they move the system away from being something like 97%. This fact is in my book, and it's from Richard Hirsch's research. It's like 97% industrial generation to like 3%. Okay, that's a very wasteful decision that had massive implications for the amount of combustion and greenhouse gases that we put into the atmosphere. Now, more directly, they just promoted climate denial. If you know the Global Climate Coalition, a climate denial organization that operated throughout the 1990s, this was funded by the Edison Electric Institute and had participation from many companies, including Southern Company. In fact, in 2017, the current CEO of Southern Company went on television and contested that climate change was real. We're talking a couple of years ago. And of course, as I detail in my book, they've also been attacking the very small piecemeal climate policies that we have on the books. If you're interested in this story and want to share it with others and you don't have a copy of my book, I published it online on the website Drilled News, which Amy Westervelt runs. It's a very fantastic reporting organization about these issues. And so feel free to look at that, use it in classes, send it to whoever. You don't need to have the book to learn about this topic. If you'd like to get a copy of my book, it was hard to do it for a while, so I have this slide here. It's a little outdated now, but I'll still give it to you. You can either buy it from Oxford University Press, and then there's a 30% off discount code there, which you can use. Feel free to use it. And the ebook, I don't know how much it costs right now, but there's also an ebook. And the exciting new news, I have a new slide that I didn't update. Oopsie. The exciting new news is that there's also an audiobook as of a couple of weeks ago. So if you find it hard to sit down and read all the time, and I love audiobooks, I'm actually doing War and Peace as an audiobook right now, very fun. Get the audiobook. It's a lot easier to get through a book sometimes if you're just listening to it. So thank you so much. I hope that was interesting. And I have left 15 minutes for questions. So maybe Rachel will come on and tell us how we're going to do it, but probably you could raise your hands during using the participation thing.
Yeah, I was trying to figure out, how do we raise our hands on this? Is there a way?
I muted myself. I think if you go to participant, you can click raise your hand and then they'll show up in the queue and we'll see it. And I know people have probably also been chatting away in the chat box, which I never pay attention to. Sorry, what I'm talking about.
I'm gonna live dangerously here and just ask if anybody has a question to go ahead and unmute themselves and see if we can.
Yeah, Pamela seems to be unmuted currently. Maybe she wants to ask a question.
Hey, I got a question.
Oh, sure. I'll jump in first, maybe.
Hey, Pamela.
Sorry, I didn't raise my hand. Yeah, my question was about if you could talk a little bit about the specifics of the electric utility industry as opposed to sort of big money in politics in general, right? I mean, we all know after Citizens United, there's this sort of flood of big money. And could you identify, I mean, what are the particular characteristics in terms of the electric utilities? Are they using particular methods that are, say, different than other big money lobbying groups? I mean, what is unique about them? And they seem, I mean, it's a really interesting study that you have done because it seems like they're kind of caught off guard, right? At the beginning where you're talking about the sort of fog, and then they sort of revamp. And I'm wondering if, I mean, it surprises me that they were caught off guard, you know, at the early, that they just weren't organized, or they hadn't sort of discovered how the money system works. So I wonder if you could kind of walk through what makes them unique as a big money, you know, driver here.
Sure, that's a great question. Thank you, Pamela. Well, first I'll say that my discipline of political science does not by any means have a consensus that money in politics is a problem or that it shapes policy. That may surprise all of you. I obviously share the view that I think Pamela was expressing, that it does shape policy and behavior. And so some of the things that I was describing about the ways that primaries are used to shape behavior and positions that politicians take, that's not a consensus view in my discipline, just to be clear. So it may feel like, what? How is that possible? But trust me when I say there are many papers written that money in politics is basically consumption, that it doesn't change behavior, etc. I don't share those views. My empirical work, not just in this book, but also in this paper I wrote called Legislative Staff and Representation in Congress, shows that I don't share that view, but it is certainly not the view of the discipline of political science. I'll just say that. In terms of how are electric utilities different? Great question. Electric utilities are largely, although not exclusively, monopoly corporations that have captured customers, right? And so that means that if you are a customer of Arizona Public Service because you happen to live in the neighborhood in Phoenix where they are the utility provider, you don't have a choice as to whether or not you are funding anti-climate behavior. Things like putting $40 million to oppose a ballot initiative, right? Because there's no exit option here. You're buying an essential service, namely electricity, and you get assigned a provider by virtue of your home address. And I think that raises really big ethical concerns about why are these companies allowed to use money from all of us to fund anti-democratic, anti-climate campaigns. And there's a lot of controversy about this, not just with electric utilities, but also gas utilities. Right now in California, SoCalGas is under quite a bit of political pressure, including from the California Advocate's Office, about the amount of money that they've been using from their ratepayers to fund these kinds of fake astroturfing campaigns. And keep in mind what happened in Ohio. First Energy didn't get that money from nowhere. They didn't get that $60 million, you know, under the couch cushions. They got it from rates, ultimately. That's how electric utilities make money. They charge us for electricity. And what did they do with that money in that dark money campaign? I don't know if you've been following the details, but they did things like physically assault people who were collecting signatures for a ballot initiative to try to overturn the coal bailout. So, you know, these are really big moral problems that we're talking about here. They're showing corruption at a level that we don't necessarily see in other industries, and that's because electric utilities only make money by being regulated, right? Their profits are assigned to them as a function of their regulator. And so, as Chris Hayes pointed out in that interview that I did, that creates an incentive for them to become really good at capturing the regulatory process, and they become really good at basically corruption. So I think we really need to be asking whether or not electric utilities should be able to do this political spending. It's one thing to say that Citizens United is wrong, and I think that myself, and that all corporations shouldn't be able to spend this kind of money in politics. Yes, I agree. But not all corporations have a captured customer base for an essential service, right? That you have no exit option. There are, of course, monopoly concerns in other areas of our economy right now, like Silicon Valley, Amazon, etc. And those concerns are very well placed. But the electric utility industry is a literal monopoly, and it is an essential service. So those are some of the things that I think make the industry particularly egregious in the ways that it has been operating over the last decade.
Another question on the phone?
Yeah, Matt.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Sorry I came late to the presentation. I tied up today. What a fascinating book you must have there. I am very steeped in New York State electric utilities. And I would ask if you've made any distinction in your work with the like New York, New England, California. These are ISOs or RTOs regulated by the federal government. They're competitive markets for the generation. And theoretically, in New York, a megawatt coming from wind or solar is paid the same thing for capacity, same thing for energy as the dirtiest fossil or the nuclear, whatever you want to compare it to. In other words, it's a commodity that's in a market that's regulated by the federal government. And the source of supply in New York is getting heavily, I would just say, directed by state policy. State and New York wants extremely high percentages of renewables. So comments on federal RTO, ISOs, and state policy, please.
Yeah, of course there are interactions between the federal government and the state governments, especially when we have RTOs operating in certain parts of the country. There's a lot more oversight for FERC. And of course, under the Trump administration, that has also resulted in things like the MOPR rule, right? The minimum offer price rule, which is a way of subsidizing coal, basically, and gas above and beyond renewables. And so I guess my view is that a lot of these markets end up being quite constructed based on political interests. They're not magical markets that align prices in a fair way. Of course, we can point that out when it comes to negative externalities, things like air pollution, carbon emissions, et cetera. But even just directly in terms of how the markets get constructed, I gave the MOPR example of that, but the Ohio case, which is in my book, which is operating in a competitive marketplace, First Energy and AEP and a bunch of other utilities owned these coal plants and nuclear plants that were not competitive. They were not able to compete in the market. And so what did they do? They didn't shut those plants down because they weren't competitive. What they did was they sought a giant bailout over the course of many years and eventually secured it. And so basically what happened was there's money being paid to make those generators whole by ratepayers by virtue of state law. So I guess my point is that markets are constructed by policymakers, and they are able to be influenced by interest groups, including electric utilities, and particularly under the Trump administration, we have seen more of that. And so I think there's a lot of potential for competitive markets to be pushing out coal in particular because it's uneconomic, right? But in fact, there was this fantastic study a week or two ago by Energy Innovation showing that if we had a competitive market in the Southeast, that a lot of operate, for example, that are uneconomic, meaning you could replace them with a wind generator tomorrow and the wind generator would be cheaper, that we could have some market pressure to push those out. So I think that markets can be really helpful, but I would just point to the MOPR rule and the Ohio Bill HB6 as examples of how markets can also be manipulated in the same kinds of ways that I've been showing throughout. So that's not so much about New York State, it's about other states. But yeah, I think competitive markets have some potential to help us solve this problem with some caveats around it.
Another question on the phone? Yeah, hi Leah, thanks so much.
Oh yeah, sorry, go ahead, yes.
Yeah, thanks so much for your comments. Really appreciate the presentation, really informative. I'm just curious your thoughts around, we've seen an awful lot of nuclear subsidies in various states, and for the most part, those have been blue states. Mm-hmm. And I think, I'm just curious your view in terms of the tactics used. I mean, it seems somewhat the same with regard to the symbiotic relationships you described and the mechanics for securing those types of out-of-market subsidy payments. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are in terms of, is this really a, stop renewable energy effort, or is this, is there a more focused effort to, let's look at what facilities are troubled or facing hardships given some of the competitive market pressures you mentioned, and we're seeing a fair amount of that, and it seems to me that the tactics are somewhat similar.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the tactics are similar. There have been very large scandals related to nuclear bailouts, similar to the one that I've been talking about in HB6 in Ohio. And, you know, there are questions about how much money should be paid to nuclear plants to keep them open. And my own view is that nuclear is a carbon-free resource. And as I mentioned, it's more than half of the carbon-free resources that we have in our electricity system right now. And there's a big risk if we shut down those plants that we will build more gas and that we will intensify, that we will increase the carbon intensity of our electricity system. So, you know, probably, particularly absent a price on carbon or absent any policies that are saying, you know, hey, coal and gas, you have negative externalities through carbon pollution, through air pollution, et cetera. You got to pay for that. Methane leakage, all that stuff. You got to pay for that. You know, we don't have an even playing field right now at all. And so there may be reasons to say that nuclear, to have an even playing field, needs to have financial support. That financial support, however, needs to be done in a way that is transparent and open, particularly so that it doesn't lead to kind of cross-subsidization. What I mean by that is, you take some of the money that you got for your nuclear bailout and you use it to bail out a coal plant. And that's probably what happened in Ohio with this plant called the Samus plant. The Samus coal plant was scheduled to retire. First Energy got a massive bailout for its nuclear plants. It got the way how much money they needed. And so the CEO, as well as a public relations person, both said, if we get that nuclear money, we're going to have $40 to $50 million that we can use for our coal plant so we can keep it open. Well, where did that $40 to $50 million magically come from, right? So I think that there are probably justifiable reasons to try to keep nuclear plants that are safe open, and we probably need to pay for them because they actually provide a benefit that's not at all priced into the system, but it has to be done in a transparent way. In terms of the broader dynamics, you're right. With their nuclear plants as they have with their coal plants. The difference where I tend to think about it is that, you know, there may be interest that we all share in keeping those nuclear plants open as we try to ramp up renewables, versus there's no interest that we all share in keeping coal plants subsidized and open. So yeah, ultimately utilities are profit-seeking entities that can seek profit regardless of the resource. But right now, a lot of the resources that they seek profits for are fossil fuels. And a lot of the resources that they see threatening their profits are renewables. That isn't for every can get about electric utilities. So I don't know if somebody else wants to unmute and give a last question here. Otherwise, I'll let Kevin or Rachel close us off.
No other questions?
Yeah, Rachel Jean Fox. Just a question about what states do you feel are doing a better job, if any?
We can't hear you.
I think you got to speak a little closer to the mic.
Oh, I'm just on top of it. Let me see, turn this up.
Now we can hear you, Jean.
What states, if any, or countries, say in Europe, are doing this the best or better than others?
You know, people love to think that Europe is ahead of us, but Europe has a lot of the similar problems. Maybe not corruption at the scale we're talking about, but just listen to what Greta Thunberg and what she says. She's not very happy with Europe either. And actually, there's another book that recently came out by one of my colleagues named Carbon Captured, and we're doing a climate book club about it if you're interested. And that looks at climate efforts around the world. And, you know, the US is terrible, but pretty much everywhere is terrible. So I wouldn't necessarily say some other country is amazingly ahead of us. In some ways, the US has been a global leader. Germany, in some ways, apart from, you know, its own coal subsidy problems, has been a global leader. So there's been some bright spots, but no, we don't have global leadership on climate change, tragically. And hopefully we have an opportunity right now, if we could just elect a person who's not a climate denier to the White House, that maybe the United States could become a global leader. So again, not a very happy story. And I know people disagree with me about that, but I tend to be in the Greta Thunberg camp of things called we're not moving fast enough, and there is no magical Scandinavian country that is better than the rest of us. All
On
right,
that
Rachel, do you want to sign us off?
Yeah, I was going to say, on that optimistic note, I'd like to thank Dr. Stokes for joining us and that really interesting talk. This is really my bread and butter and interest. And so I really enjoyed it, and enjoyed the chat on the side for all of you who were sharing resources and talking about some of the technical side issues. And so this will be posted online, so feel free to share later. And we will be going to, I don't know when our next talk is, but go to the REI website to find out our next talk. And thank you all for joining us. So thanks, Leah.
Thanks for having me. Good luck,
Thank you very
everybody.
much.
Hope you have some
Thank
other
you.
great talks. Thanks for the
Thanks.
questions and for what I assume were very nice comments in the chat that I did not read.
can read.
Lovely to see all of you. And yeah, keep up the hope. I'm not trying to be depressing, but we got an opportunity here, so we got to try to hopefully win. All right, bye everybody.